All right. Namaskar, I'm Captain Smita Gaikwad, and today we are going to discuss about urban Maoism for next around 1 hour. I was told that the session will be for 45 minutes to 1 hour, and after that we'll have a question and answer session. So, what we are going to cover today, let's start with the subject. Can you all see the screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So we are going to see the basics of Maoism, then the urban dimension of it, why urban Maoism, and we'll take a look at some case studies of convicted Maoists. Why convicted Maoists or why dead Maoists? Because uh, most of the leaders, the Maoist leaders, they are either intellectuals or they are working as human rights activists or lawyers. Some of them are convicted, some of them are not convicted as yet, some of them are accused. So the reason we are going to take case studies of convicted Maoists is so that uh, the reason behind it is that the law has already put that stamp of member of a proscribed terrorist organization, that is CPI Maoist. That stamp has been put on them, and that's the reason we are going to take a look at those case studies. Because if we do not consider the convicted Maoist, we just take a look at accused Maoist, in that case, what would happen is people may question that who are you to call these people as Maoist? Apart from that, there will be certain names of people who themselves present themselves as Maoist intellectuals or Maoist leaders. So we are also going to take a look at these kind of intellectuals as well. So let us first start with the basics. What is the difference between Maoism and Naxalism? Many people use these two words interchangeably. So most of you must be knowing that Mao was one of the Chinese leaders, very autocratic in his approach. So whatever thoughts, whatever teachings of Mao are, those are called as Maoism in a very general sense. The implementation, the practical implementation of this Maoism in India, we call it Naxalism. Now, why this word Naxalism? Because this practical implementation, they say that it started in Naxalbari, and after that, the word Naxalism came into existence. We are going to get into the details of it. So, in a way, Naxalism is the Make in India version of Maoism, or we can say the local form of Maoism is Naxalism. Now, let us start with this news. This is a recent news in the month of July. So that news said that nearly 100 global intellectuals appeal for Varvara Rao and GN Sai Baba to be released. Now, out of all these 100 intellectuals, they wrote to the president and to the Chief Justice of India saying that GN Sai Baba and Varvara Rao are they should be released. That is what they are saying. And they are not just stopping at that, they are going one step forward, and they said in their statement that they are fixed in a fabricated case. Now I can understand that intellectuals of the world, if they say that certain accused or certain convicted Maoists who are in jail, like GN Sai Baba. So if somebody says that because of the COVID situation, that person should be given bail, that is understandable because there is nothing illegal in it. But here they are going just one step forward and they are saying that these people are booked in fabricated cases. Now, this is something not factual. This is something very different from reality. This is not true at all, because the Elgar case, we are going to get into the details of it if time permits. So that particular case is not a fabricated case at all. From session court to Supreme Court, it has been repeatedly mentioned by various judges that there is prima facie evidence against the accused that they are having links or they were actively participating in the conspiracy of the proscribed terrorist organization CPI Maoist. Now, out of these 100 global intellectuals, I was just going through the list, and the list of universities, which is written there on the screen, you can read them. So that those are the universities from Canada, and the professors or the directors of these research centers or universities, they have signed this statement, or they are the ones who requested President of India and the Chief Justice that Varvara Rao and GN Sai Baba should be released. Now, why do I consider this particular session as very important session is because the audience, most of them for this session, they are residing in Canada. Probably many of you may be working in some of these universities. The people, the professors who signed this letter, there are two possibilities. These people, whether they are inclined towards Maoist ideology, I really do not know, but that is one possibility. Second possibility is either these people do not know anything about this case, or whatever they have been told about this case is all lies. So it is really important that truth has to reach to these people. I would like to give them benefit of doubt that they do not know about this case, and whoever has approached them for this letter or for the signatures, probably they have not given the real picture. So considering that, there is a need that these kind of people, they should be educated on these cases. Now, who can do that? So the people who are residing there in Canada, the people like who are listening to this session, they can actually play an active role, an important role in correcting this narrative and making sure that these intellectuals are educated with facts and evidences. And that's the reason I consider this particular session as very important session. So let's begin with the basics. So when we talk about Maoism or Naxalism, it is considered as a type of fourth generation warfare. So what is fourth generation warfare? So as time goes or time changes, the type of warfare changes. So in fourth generation warfare, enemy is invisible and the battle is for the control of civil society. So what do we mean by enemy is invisible? That means that enemy is there, but we are not able to recognize that enemy. So the person who is sitting next to us may be a Maoist, but we do not know that that person is a Maoist. That is what we mean by enemy is invisible. Secondly, the battle is for the control of civil society. That can happen either through coercion, or it can happen by controlling the hearts and minds of people, or delivering results by redressing grievances. Now, just an example of this. When the Maoists, they entered Dandakaranya, especially in Maharashtra, in Chhattisgarh, when they entered, they started saying, or they started telling the tribal that they will give the right price for Tendupatta. So for example, if the tribal were getting X amount for Tendupatta in those years, the Maoists assured them that we will give you 3X amount. Now, because of this, what happened is, the tribal felt that whatever work or whatever time we are investing, in return, we are going to get triple money. So that is something which made them happy. And they started feeling that these Maoists have actually come here to make sure that we get our rights. So that kind of impression created by the Maoists in the beginning. Because of that, what happened is the tribals started trusting these people, because the Maoists actually control the hearts and minds of these tribal by delivering results, by making sure that the Tendupatta contractors give them better prices for whatever work they were doing earlier. In the beginning, it all looked very nice, very beautiful. Later on, what happened is, when the Maoists realized that these tribals are actually now under their control, they started forcing them to do certain things. Now, when this forceful thing started by the Maoists, the tribals started realizing that Maoists are just using them, or they are kind of terrorizing them if they do not do certain work which the Maoists tell them to do. So this is just one example how warfare, there are efforts to control the civil society. Another characteristic of this warfare is there is blurring of line between war and politics and combatants and civilians. What does that mean? So in case of terrorism, or when the terrorists enter the Indian, they get into the Indian land, then they generally have weapons in their hands, and it is easy to recognize them as a combatant or as a person who is fighting against India with weapon in hand. In case of fourth generation warfare, it is really difficult to differentiate between a combatant and a civilian. So what does that mean? Just to give you an example, in the year 2018, when there were arrests in case of this Elgar Parishad case, many of the civilians, they gathered in Mumbai outside the Chembur station. And why were they present there? Because Sudhir Dhawale was arrested. And according to those civilians who were standing outside that police station, according to them, Sudhir Dhawale, who was accused as a Maoist by the police, Maharashtra police that time, according to police, he was arrested because he had links with a proscribed terrorist organization, CPI Maoist. But the people who were standing there outside that police station in support of Sudhir Dhawale, for them, Sudhir Dhawale was an Ambedkarite. So here there was a difference in perception that for the police, he was a combatant who was actually fighting for CPI Maoist without a weapon in his hand. And for the civilians who were there to support him, for them, he was an Ambedkarite. So this is one example that how in fourth generation warfare, it is difficult to differentiate between a combatant and a civilian. Another thing is there is a blurring line between war and politics. What does that mean? Elgar Parishad case is the best example to explain this particular concept, because it is the most politicized case, and many people think that whatever happened in Koregaon Bhima on 1st of January 2018, it was a fight between two groups based on caste. Some people think that it was just a rivalry, some political rivalry, and because of that, that thing happened. And actually, the people, the groups who actually created that situation and made those things happen were different. Thus, it is difficult to characterize, or the line between war and politics is really, it is difficult to differentiate between war and politics. That is what one of the characteristics of this fourth generation warfare. Now, Maoism is one example of fourth generation warfare. When Maoism started in India, so if we get into the details of history, so from 46 to 49 in Andhra, there were certain skirmishes, or there was anti-Nizam movement which was already going on. And after independence, some of those armed revolutionaries, they were still fighting against the Indian government even after independence. So from 46 to 49, already that that fight between Indian army and the revolutionaries was going on. That time, some of them, like the leadership of those revolutionaries, some of them were of the opinion that they need to follow the Russian thought process or the Russian way of fighting, and some of them were of the opinion that no, they need to follow the Maoist way of fighting, like whatever Mao followed in China, by using the peasants. And that is how the thought of following Mao's line started in India or amongst the leftists. After that, in the year 67, there was this revolt in Naxalbari. So this particular revolt was just for 52 days. And if we take a look at the location where actually it happened, so it was exactly on the Chicken Neck. So this thin line which connects the northeastern states of India to remaining India. So exactly on the Chicken Neck, this place or this village called Naxalbari is there. So it is on the tri-junction of Nepal, Bangladesh, and India. It's a reliable hinterland, so somebody can take some action, some armed action here, and they can go and hide in these countries. That is possible. So that was the uniqueness about this particular location. Apart from that, the strategic location, I mean, strategically also, this Naxalbari was really important, because if we cut Chicken Neck, then the northeastern states of India can be separated from rest of India. Considering that particular aspect, the location of Naxalbari was really strategically important. So the 1967, the revolt which took place, it went on for 52 days. There were three leaders who were actually leading this particular revolt: Charu Mazumdar, Jangal Santhal, and Kanu Sanyal. So Charu Mazumdar was the brain, Jangal Santhal was actually mobilizing people, and Kanu Sanyal was the one who was looking into the organizational aspects. So this is the background of what exactly happened in 1967. Now let us, and I'm just getting into these things very briefly because we just have 1 hour and we need to get into the details of history also and the present situation also. So let's take a look at what Maoists really want. So in 67 also, Maoists were interested in the political power. So if you there is an organization called Virasam, also known as Revolutionary Writers Association. It is called as the front organization of CPI Maoist. So in the year 2014, UPA government declared a list of 74 Maoist front organizations. In that also, this Virasam or Revolutionary Writers Association was enlisted. One of the founders of this Virasam is Varvara Rao, who is accused in the Elgar Parishad case. So in the year 2017, which was the 50th anniversary year of 1967 revolt of Naxalbari. So in 2017, this Virasam organized a seminar and they published those seminar papers. So in those seminar papers, there was one article. In that article, it was mentioned that this Naxalbari revolt, it was not only a struggle to take over the land, although in agrarian revolution, the land question is of immense importance, but according to them, that the struggle which is limited only for land, they call it economism, or maximally it can be called as militant economism. But according to the Maoist or according to the Naxal theory, the militant, however militant that economism would be, that is not sufficient. The ultimate aim of that struggle was seizure of state power, and that particular question came forward in a concrete form during the Naxalbari revolt. That is what the seminar papers says. Another thing it mentions is there was one magazine called Dakshin Desh. This magazine was run by the Maoists. Why it is called as Dakshin Desh? Because as per Mao's dream, he wanted to make the whole world communist. So according to him, China is the Uttar Desh and India is the Dakshin Desh. That's one of the reasons why this magazine was named as Dakshin Desh. So this magazine said that the lesson of Naxalbari is the real application of the lessons of Mao. So whatever Mao taught, so in Naxalbari, those teachings were actually implemented. And beyond that, they say that Mao's teaching of establishing base areas in villages, that is what was implemented during the Naxalbari revolt. Such revolutionary bases will one by one form a chain around the cities in such a way that the enemy will not have a path to escape. So there are two takeaways from this particular slide. The Maoist, even in 1967, their aim was seizure of political power. Land to the tiller was one of the aspects, but the ultimate aim of Maoist was seizure of political power. Another important takeaway from this particular slide is it was implementation of Mao's teachings. What were those teachings? Mao said that if you want to win a war against your enemy, you have to encircle the enemy by revolutionary bases. So there has to be a chain of revolutionary bases, and that through those chains, the Maoists have to encircle the enemy and then attack the enemy. So the Maoists, when they started or when they went to places like Dandakaranya, they did not go there to give rights of the tribal. They went there because Dandakaranya was a place which was suitable and safe for Maoists to establish the base areas as taught by Mao. So Maoists had to train their armed cadre. They had to make sure that the base areas are safe. No police or no army can have access to it. So to form or to establish those kind of base areas, the Maoists actually went to Dandakaranya. In the same seminar papers, there was one paper by N. Ravi in that it is mentioned that the struggle for power is the principal aspect, but it cannot be separated from the struggle for economic and other partial struggles. To put it differently, they are two sides of the same coin. So everywhere, repeatedly, they are saying that the struggle for power is the principal aspect. So Maoists, when they started that 67 revolt also, the seizure of political power was their basic aim. However, we were told for all 50 years in last like 67 till 2017, and now it is 2020, so almost more than 50 years, we were always told that the Naxalbari revolt was actually to give rights of the poor peasants to them, but that is just one aspect of it, and that was not the ultimate aim. The ultimate aim of that Naxalbari revolt was to was seizure of political power, and that too through armed struggle. There's a book called Revolutionary Violence versus Democracy. In that book also, there are different articles by authors like Varvara Rao, Anand Teltumbde, Professor Har Gopal. So in one of the articles, Varvara Rao, he says that the Naxalbari struggle envisaged the economic struggle for land to the tiller, guerrilla form of struggle to protect it, and the political program of sieging the state power. So repeatedly, the Maoist documents are talking about seizure of political power as one of the aims of this Naxalbari revolt. Now, this is about 1967. Now let us see what the Maoists say in the year 2004. In the year 2004, different factions of Naxal or Maoist organization in India, they came together and they formed CPI Maoist. When the CPI Maoist was formed in the year 2004, Maoists came up with different strategy documents, 5 of them actually. So 2 of these documents are important if we want to understand the urban dimension of Maoism. One is Strategy and Tactics of Indian Revolution. So this anti-India war by Maoists, they call it Indian Revolution. So whenever a Maoist say that a revolution is happening or they are going to do revolution, that means they are talking about that anti-India war. So this first document is Strategy and Tactics of Indian Revolution, and the second document is Urban Perspective, Our Work in Urban Areas. So the second document basically talks about how to work in urban areas, and the first document talks about the overall strategy and tactics of this anti-India war. So in this first document, the Maoists say that the central task of their revolution is seizure of political power through protracted people's war. Here, this word protracted is important. They are talking about a long-term war. They have been fighting for 50 years. They are ready to fight for next 50 years. So this is going to be a protracted people's war. Another important word to be noticed in this is it is a people's war, they call it. Now, why they call it people's war? Because they want to use common citizen of this country against this government itself. So this is a war in which people are being used by the Maoists, and that's why they are calling it people's war. Later, they say that to accomplish this central task, they are nowhere saying that they want to ensure that they want to give rights to the suppressed or oppressed or to the underprivileged. They are not saying that as their central task. They are saying that seizure of political power is their central task. Then they say that to accomplish this central task, the Indian people will have to wipe out the armed forces of the Indian state through war and establish in its place the people's democratic state. Now, here they're saying that they want to establish a people's democratic state. India itself, right, even today, India is a democracy, it is a democratic state. However, the Maoists, in their narrative, always say that it is not a people's democracy. If you ask them that how this people's democracy is going to be different from the current democracy, whatever people's democracy the Maoists propose, how it is going to be different from the current democracy, they really do not have any concrete answers to it. But they just keep on saying that this particular democracy is not the real democracy. Whatever they are going to bring is the real democracy. Then they say the very act of establishment of the state machinery of people by destroying through war the state's army, police, and the bureaucratic machinery is the central task of People's Democratic Revolution of India. So the takeaways from this slide is the Maoists all the time, like they were saying in 1967, even in 2004, they mentioned that seizure of political power is their aim, but they do not want to do it through electoral means. They do not want to contest elections. So what they want to do, they want to achieve that power, or they want to seize that power through armed revolution. And they are planning to use the common people of this country against the government, and they want to bring anarchy by destroying the armed forces, the police forces, the state machinery, and the bureaucratic machinery. Another question is to hold together a big and a diverse country like India, what plans or what uh, system or what model the Maoists are going to propose, or how it is going to be successful, whether it is a tested model. There is no positive answer to these questions, but Maoists are just interested in destroying whatever is existing, bring in anarchy, and they say that by destroying all these things, they are going to bring people's democratic state. So this is the ultimate aim of Maoism. So Maoists say that they are working for, or many people, in fact, whenever I go for these lectures, so many people ask this question that Maoists are actually working for the underprivileged people. The question is, if somebody is working for underprivileged or making sure that the oppressed get their rights, that particular person won't need to take weapon in hand. There are so many NGOs, there are so many families like Dr. Bang or Dr. Amte who are working for the betterment of the tribal. They never felt the need to take up arms in their hand. So the reason these Maoists feel the need to take up arms in hand is because their objectives are different. Their objectives are seizure of political power through the armed revolution. So their objective is not to make sure that people get their rights. Their objective is just seizure of political power. So this is the objective. Now, how they want to achieve it? How will they do it? So they say that they will do it through 3 magic weapons. Now, what are those 3 magic weapons? So the Maoist document says that Party, Armed Cadre, and the United Front, these are the 3 magic weapons through which they are going to win this war against India. So what is Party? So people who are influenced and convinced by the Maoist philosophy, the Maoist ideology, the Maoist thought process, and who believe in the political idea of Maoism. So those people are part of this party. Another thing is the central committee members, uh, the Politburo members of CPI Maoist, all those people they are part of this party. Armed cadre are the people who actually fight with weapons in their hands, and we see them in places like Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, generally during the encounters with CRPF or local police in those areas. So that is armed cadre. And the third one is United Front. So what is this United Front? So United Front is the network which Maoists have established in urban areas or in semi-urban areas and even in villages. So this particular network is a network of Maoist front organizations. So what kind of front organizations are there in this United Front? There are students organizations, there are women related organizations, there are organizations related to specific issues. For example, if some development project is going to come up in some area, then if people lose their lands, or if people have to give the land for that particular project, then there are certain organizations which will unite these kind of people. So that is also those kind of front organization also exist. Then there are front organizations which work for release of political prisoners. Then there are front organizations which works for Dalits. There are front organizations which work specifically for women. So there is a range of front organizations. There are legal organizations. Some of them are democratic, like they operate in a democratic framework. There are cultural organizations. So this network of all these kind of organizations which work in different parts of the country, they call it United Front. Thus, through these 3 magic weapons, the Maoists say that they are going to fight this war against India. It is important to note here that I generally give this example that if the enemy is fighting with a sword in hand, with a AK-47 or any gun in hand, you cannot fight with that enemy with a sword in hand. Here the enemy is saying that he would fight with United Front kind of weapon. So it is important for us to understand or to think that what could be the counter to these kind of approaches by the enemy. So this is about the basics of Maoism. Now let us see some important events or some important statements by the government about this urban Maoism. So in the year 2006, Union Home Minister Shivraj Patil, in the Lok Sabha, he made a statement that the Maoists are focusing on the urban infrastructure, and like the jungles, they give a suitable place to the Maoists for hiding. Similarly, urban areas also provide that kind of suitable place for the Maoists. In the year 2013, November 2013 to be precise, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the central ministry, they filed an affidavit before the Supreme Court. In that affidavit, they specifically mentioned that the urban cadre of Maoist is more dangerous as compared to the jungle cadre. In the same affidavit, they said that the urban cadre, they work in the garb of human rights activists, professors, lawyers, and other social social organization activists. And whenever the government or the police, they take action against these activists, the propaganda mechanism of these Maoist or these front organizations is so strong that they try to destroy the credibility of that government or the police agencies who are taking action against these front organizations or the urban cadre. And it becomes really difficult for the government or the agencies to take action because of this propaganda machinery. If we take a look at what happened after 2018, especially when these intellectuals who are accused of being actively involved in the conspiracy of CPI Maoists, so whatever propaganda happened after those arrests, that gives a fair idea of what was said in the year 2013. In February 2014, UPA government, while answering to a question in Lok Sabha, they declared a list of 74 Maoist front organizations. As I mentioned in the beginning, this Revolutionary Writers Association, which is Varvara Rao's organization, was also one of those front organizations enlisted by UPA government as Maoist fronts. Apart from that, the organizers of Elgar Parishad, Kabir Kala Manch, was also one of the Maoist front organization, enlisted Maoist front organization by UPA in February 2014. So this is just a background of what has happened earlier in the previous government era in reference to urban Maoism. Now, why urban areas are important for Maoists? So as shelter for the cadre, as transit point. So if a person has to travel from Andhra to Jharkhand, for example, so instead of traveling through jungles, the person may just take a bus and travel to the required location. In such a situation, the Maoists do need transit points. That's the reason urban areas are important for them. Just to give you an example, some of the accused Maoists who were linked with Kabir Kala Manch, they were arrested from Thane in the year 2010 or 11. So that time we were thinking like, why Thane? So if you see the connectivity of Thane with Nasik, Pune, even Gujarat, so all these places are easily connected or convenient. It is convenient to travel to these places from that particular location. So that could be one of the reasons for residing in such locations. Thus, shelter for cadre as transit point, because the urban areas provide that shelter, and that's why they are important. Money management. So the money or whatever fundraising happens, there are different ways the Maoists do fundraising. One of the ways is they extract money from, or they force the contractors in Dandakaranya area to provide money. So whatever money is collected, the management actually happens through these intellectuals or the leaders who are in urban areas. So that is one of the reasons urban areas are important for them. Sources of weapon and explosives, logistic support, legal aid and legal protection. There is something called as legal warfare, which is part of the fourth generation warfare. So the Maoist, whenever any Maoist cadre, whether a cadre who is arrested in jungles or a cadre who is arrested from urban areas, any cadre arrested, any Maoist cadre or accused Maoist cadre arrested, then there is a team of lawyers to support them. So for this legal aid and legal protection, urban areas are important for Maoists. Medical aid. So Maoists do have some basic medical training, but beyond that, they have to depend on these urban areas for medical aid. Overseas contacts. Maoists do have international contacts. They do have contacts with other Maoist organizations or Maoist organizations from other countries. And this international connect, if they have to maintain, for that also urban areas are important for them. Develop intelligentsia network. So the Maoists, they do use intelligentsia network to push their propaganda. Does that mean that all these intellectuals are inclined towards Maoism or convinced by Maoism? Maybe or may not be. Some of them may be just used by these Maoist intellectuals without them knowing that they are actually being used by the Maoists. Media attention, this is important for them to push their propaganda. So that's why urban areas are important. And last and the most important thing is urban areas are stronghold of government and for ultimate aim of taking over democracy to achieve Maoist rule. So what does this mean? So as per Maoist strategy, they say that the urban areas is the place where the government is strong, the police machinery is strong, or even the paramilitary forces are comparatively strong there. So, as per Maoist strategy, it is said that they need to establish the revolutionary bases encircling the enemy, and gradually they have to come towards these urban areas for their final phase of revolution. So the final attack or the final so-called revolution would happen in the last stage. However, they need to mobilize people since beginning for this final phase of revolution. And that's the reason urban areas are important, and the Maoists do focus on the urban areas since beginning. Now let us take example of few convicted Maoists. The recent one, like of course these Elgar Parishad accused are there, but we are just going to take a look at the convicted ones. So this GN Sai Baba is one such example. GN Sai Baba is physically challenged. He cannot walk. He has to use wheelchair. In the year 1991, he shifted to Delhi from the erstwhile Andhra. It is said that the Maoist party asked him to shift. In September 2013, when NCP and Congress government was there in Maharashtra, they raided his house. In March 2014, when BJP government, no, that time also BJP government was not there. So in March 2014, the arrest actually happened. And May 2017, when the BJP government was there, so that was the time the Gadchiroli court convicted GN Sai Baba for working for this CPI Maoist. This GN Sai Baba he was the secretary of Revolutionary Democratic Front. Revolutionary Democratic Front is yet another Maoist front organization which was enlisted in February 2014 when UPA government declared the list of Maoist fronts in Lok Sabha. This Revolutionary Democratic Front, through this Revolutionary Democratic Front, GN Sai Baba, he recruited various students, various intellectuals, and also established national and international network of Maoists. When he was convicted and he was there in jail, that time the United Nations Human Rights Council, they issued a statement saying that this GN Sai Baba was like, though he was convicted by our court, the judicial process, whatever legal process which was to be followed, it was followed properly. Despite that, this particular statement by the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner said that whatever process was followed was not convincing according to that statement. Thus, the interest of the international community in GN Sai Baba or people like him who are convicted as Maoist is, it gives an idea what kind of network these people have or how they actually convince or how they present the facts in a different manner, so that even organizations like United Nations get convinced that there is some problem the way the legal process happened. Reality is the legal process happened as per the laid down processes without any kind of any kind of foul play in it, but despite that, this kind of impression is being created internationally about the Maoism related cases. Now this RDF, let us just take one more example, or let us just look at this RDF. In the year 2012, April 22nd and 23rd, there was one conference by this Revolutionary Democratic Front. So GN Sai Baba was the secretary, and during this conference, Varvara Rao, who is one of the accused in Elgar Parishad case, he was elected as the president of this RDF. There is a report of this National Conference of RDF. That report is available on Google. If you search for it, you will get 3-4 different websites who will flash this report. So the report says that Professor Anand Teltumbde, who was present for this RDF conference, noted civil rights activist, this Anand Teltumbde is also one of the accused in this Elgar Parishad case. So this RDF, so we started with GN Sai Baba, who was secretary of this RDF. RDF is a Maoist Front organization, and this Maoist Front organization organized a national conference, their first national conference in Hyderabad on 22nd and 23rd April in 2012. And the report of the conference, which is available on Google on various websites, the report says that Professor Anand Teltumbde, who is also one of the accused in Elgar Parishad case, they are calling him noted civil rights activist. He emphasized the need for the Dalit and revolutionary movement to come together to annihilate caste and to complete the democratic revolution in the country. He was critical of the parliamentary left like CPI, CPM, as well as identity-based parliamentary Dalit political formations, and said that there is a need to carry forward the class struggle with participation of Dalits and other oppressed masses. The important aspect is, Anand Teltumbde said that there is a need of the hour is to reinvent Dalit militancy as well as revolutionary resurgence under Maoist leadership. There were other intellectuals also present in this conference like Shoma Sen, Varvara Rao. Shoma Sen is another accused in Elgar Parishad case. She was HOD of English department of Nagpur University. She was part of one organization which works for women. The exact name of the organization I do not recall right now. It is Committee of Women, that kind of name is there. So this particular organization was also declared as a Maoist Front organization in February 2014 by the UPA government. So Shoma Sen participated in this particular conference on behalf of that particular organization. So these all people were part of this RDF conference, and they presented the thoughts like what I have just give you as an example, what Anand Teltumbde said. Now this is about RDF. So this is just an example that what kind of thought process these Maoist Front organizations propagate. If somebody has a doubt that whether RDF is a Maoist Front organization or not, so I'm not calling it as a Maoist Front organization. The UPA government declared it as a Maoist Front organization. And apart from that, this verdict of GN Sai Baba case, it is almost some 800 pages verdict. In that also, the details of this Revolutionary Democratic Front are there. In that, the documents of Revolutionary Democratic Front are presented as evidence, and those were accepted by the Gadchiroli court. And in those documents, the Revolutionary Democratic Front itself says that it does not believe in democracy and it believes in the Maoist way of functioning. And rightfully, it was declared as a Maoist Front organization by UPA. Now let us take a look at another example of Sridhar Srinivasan. This Sridhar Srinivasan was the Central Committee member of CPI Maoist. He was arrested in 2007 for Maoist links. In fact, that time NCP and Congress government was there in Maharashtra. So this Sridhar Srinivasan was basically from Kerala, and he did his education from Maharashtra. He was a student of Elphinstone College. Later on, he was working, like while in college, he got into this Maoist thought process, or they call it the revolutionary. He was influenced by the revolutionary thought process as per the Maoist terminology. So in the year 2007, he was arrested for Maoist links and he was convicted by court in the year 2013. After his conviction, like he already underwent whatever punishment was given to him by the court. And later, in the year once he was released from the jail, he again started working for Maoist. And in the year 2015, he died in Dandakaranya itself because of heart attack. In his memory, there was a program in Mumbai in Prabhadevi to glorify him as a Maoist. On the screen, you can see that this was a press release by the CPI Maoist after death of Sridhar Srinivasan. In the year 2007, when Sridhar was arrested, that time it was mentioned that Sridhar was not just an intellectual and he was wrongfully being arrested and he's being accused as a Maoist for no reason, and the government was trying to suppress the dissent. That's how it was projected. But actually, after the death of Sridhar, CPI Maoists themselves came up with a press release saying that how great Maoist Sridhar was. This is the way Maoists generally function. Whenever their cadre, especially the urban cadre, is arrested, they try to project them as civil rights activists, social workers, or people who are actually working for betterment of the country. That is how they try to project them. And when they die, they come up with this kind of press release mentioning how good revolutionaries or how good Maoists they were. So this Sridhar, when he was in college, that time itself, he got into this Maoist movement. He was working for an organization called Vidyarthi Pragati Sanghatan. After college, he got into trade unions. Through trade unions, he tried to mobilize workers for this Maoist movement. He also ensured, or he actually implemented certain militant activities through trade unions. He was working in trade unions in Mumbai areas. Later on, he was sent to Vidarbha by the CPI Maoist leadership. Vidarbha is the part of Maharashtra where Nagpur and Nagpur, Amravati, all these areas are there. So Sridhar went there and started working in those areas, and he started mobilizing the mine workers in those areas. And later he went underground and started working for the Maoist movement in Dandakaranya. In 2015, when he was traveling there, that time itself, he suffered heart attack and he got killed. He died because of heart attack. The interesting part is, after Sridhar's death, there was a program in the memory of Sridhar in Mumbai, Prabhadevi, and a book was released in his memory in the year 2016. In that book, various people wrote about Sridhar and how good Maoist he was. In that, there is one article by Anand Teltumde. Anand Teltumde is another accused in this Elgar Parishad case. So interestingly, this Anand Teltumde is being presented or being projected as a civil rights activist. The same Anand Teltumde, he wrote in his article in this particular book that Sridhar, like Maoists, are indeed Bhagat Singh of our times. So, according to Anand Teltumbde, Sridhar was like Bhagat Singh of our times. Interesting part is Bhagat Singh fought for freedom of this country against the British, and Sridhar is fighting with own people, with own government. And who was he representing? He was representing a terrorist organization, CPI Maoist, which is a proscribed terrorist organization. And according to Anand Teltumbde, people like Sridhar are Bhagat Singhs of our time. The question is, why would a civil rights activist glorify a Maoist who is against democracy or who actually works to overthrow democracy? Why would a civil rights activist glorify a person like Sridhar, who is anti-democracy, as Bhagat Singh of our times? So these kind of questions do arise when we actually go through the literature of these Maoists. Another person is Vernon Gonsalves, who was arrested with Sridhar in the year 2007 under UAPA and Arms Act. He was also convicted. So same Vernon Gonsalves is now accused in Elgar Parishad case also. This Vernon was also working for corporate earlier, then he was also a lecturer. He used to visit different colleges for lectures. He is married to a lady called Susan Abraham. She is a lawyer. She is fighting cases for these accused in Elgar Parishad case. The same Susan Abraham was also active in one of the programs of a Maoist leader, in the memory of a Maoist leader. Her name was Anuradha Gandhi. We are going to get into those details subsequently. So these are few cases we saw till now. First one was of Sridhar Srinivasan, another was GN Sai Baba, then this was Vernon Gonsalves. So all these people were convicted Maoists. They were highly intellectuals. They came from sophisticated intellectual class. When the Elgar Parishad accused were arrested, there was one point which was raised repeatedly by the media. And the point was that these people are from well-to-do families. They are highly intellectuals. They are from sophisticated background. How can they be Maoist? It is important to note here that the leadership of Maoist, it actually comes from this intellectual, highly sophisticated class. So the tribal, they did not pick up weapons against this government on their own. These intellectuals brainwashed those tribals to pick up weapons against the government by showing them dreams of better life. 2 generations of tribals have actually suffered because of this Maoist movement. And these tribals are already realized the shallowness, the hollowness of this Maoist thought process. And many of them have been surrendering, or many of them are refusing to even join this Maoist movement. And that is one more reason that there is an ebb in the recruitment of Maoists from the jungle areas. So the Maoists are also focusing on urban areas for recruitment. There were 2 youngsters, Santosh Shelar and Prashant Kamble from Pune, who joined the armed cadre of Maoists in Chhattisgarh. Santosh Shelar is one of the deputy commanders of Tanda Area Committee, that is a Maoist committee in Chhattisgarh. So he is one of the deputy commanders of that committee. Apart from that, in Chandrapur, there was one organization called Deshabhakti Yuva Manch. The name looks so patriotic. Through this Deshabhakti Yuva Manch, 13 youngsters had joined the armed cadre. So these kind of organizations, they do recruitment for the Maoist armed cadre. Now let us take a look at Anuradha Gandhi's case. This Anuradha Gandhi was She in fact died in the year 2008. She was a professor. After her death, there was one book published by JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. It was published on behalf of Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Committee. This Memorial Committee is nothing else but an initiative of Revolutionary Democratic Front. It was mentioned in the Secretary Report of Revolutionary Democratic Front. Now let us take a look. This is the photograph of Anuradha Gandhi. She looks so innocent. Okay, it's already 1 hour. Within next 5 minutes, we'll just cover this case study and then we'll stop. This was the photograph of Anuradha Gandhi when she was in her 50s. And this is the real face of Anuradha Gandhi. This photo was clicked when she was elected as one of the Central Committee members of CPI Maoist in the year, I think, 2005. So this is her photograph with the Maoist uniform and a weapon in her hand. So let us take a look at what is written about Anuradha Gandhi in that book, which is published by JNU on behalf of Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Committee. So Anuradha Gandhi was the Central Committee member of CPI Maoist. In 80s, she started one organization called Center for Protection of Democratic Rights. So this name sounds so democratic that people would start feeling that she was actually working for democratic rights. But if you see the details, the subsequent details, you would get to know that what exactly she was up to and how the Maoists actually functioned. In 1972, she started her political life at Elphinstone College again. So Sridhar was also from Elphinstone College. Anuradha Gandhi was also from Elphinstone College. She did her MA Sociology and later MPhil. She was influenced by an organization called Progressive Youth Movement, which was inspired by the Naxalite movement that time. In the year 1977, she got married to Kobad Gandhi. Kobad Gandhi is also one of the accused in more than 20 cases related to Maoism. Currently, he is on bail. So here I would like to share one interesting experience. When I was studying about Anuradha Gandhi, I came across one article. You can see that article on the screen. That article was written by Jyoti Punwani in Times of India, and the title of the article was Memories of a Naxal Friend. In that article, it was mentioned that the Naxalite menace says Manmohan Singh is the biggest threat to the country, but I remember a girl who was always laughing and gave up a rich life in every way to change the lives of others. So here, Jyoti Punwani, she is a journalist. She writes for Mumbai Mirror also. She wrote here that Anuradha Gandhi gave a rich life in every way to change the lives of others. So when I read this, I had a confusion that was it a fact that Anuradha Gandhi was actually working for betterment of people, for changing people's lives positively? With this confusion, when I went to Chhattisgarh and I interviewed some surrendered Maoists, there I came to know that what she was actually up to. So on the screen, you must be seeing this photograph of, on the right side, this photograph is one of the surrendered Maoists. So when I met him, he told me that in 90s, Anuradha Gandhi used to visit, his name, like his Dalam name is Hare Ram. So whenever a person enters Dalam, the names are changed. So according to Hare Ram, Anuradha Gandhi, I think somebody raised hand. Okay, so according to Hare Ram, Anuradha Gandhi recruited him and he worked for Maoist movement for 14 years. Apart from that, there is a book called Hello Bastar. In that book, it is mentioned that Anuradha Gandhi was, she participated in one of the encounters against police, and she even fired at police in that encounter. Thus, in Mumbai, this Anuradha Gandhi was running an organization called Center for Protection of Democratic Rights, and the same Anuradha Gandhi was fighting with police with weapon in her hand and recruiting youngsters like Hare Ram for the armed cadre of Maoist, and people like Jyoti Punwani were projecting her as saviors or the life changers of tribal. The reality is, she did not change the lives of these tribal positively. She actually destroyed lives of hundreds of tribal by recruiting them into Maoist Dalam. Many of the innocent tribals who got killed by these armed cadre. So the root cause for the death of those people is also people like Anuradha Gandhi, who recruit these youngsters, innocent youngsters, I would call them, just to prove their own theories of Maoism. The same Anuradha Gandhi, in the year 2002, she started when there was this Amarnath Chandalia. There's a person called Amarnath Chandalia. He formed one organization called Kabir Kala Manch. As I said earlier, that Kabir Kala Manch is one of the front organizations, the Maoist front organizations. In the year 2005, this Amarnath Chandalia, he gave a statement in front of magistrate that in the year 2005, he met Anuradha Gandhi, and Anuradha Gandhi used to give him rupees 4,000 to Kabir Kala Manch, collected as Nakshal tax. So that money which she used to give to Amarnath Chandalia for Kabir Kala Manch, that was collected through Nakshal tax. So what is Nakshal tax? So whatever extortion the Maoists do in those red corridor areas, or they call it liberated zones, that is called as Nakshal tax. And in the year 2008, she died. And as I said earlier, this Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Committee, it is one of the initiatives of this Revolutionary Democratic Front. The book which was published by JNU, this is what was mentioned in that book. It said that Anuradha Gandhi, when she shifted from Mumbai to Nagpur, she was staying in a place called Indora, which was there was a Dalit basti there. And because of her incisive knowledge of Ambedkar and other sociological writings on caste questions, she became the face of Maoist in that movement there. And she also drew large sections of the youth to the Naxalite movement in that area. That is what is mentioned in the book, which was published in her memory by JNU. In the year 2017, Varvara Rao was one of the speakers at Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Lecture. So after her death in 2008, there have been a memorial lecture every year in Mumbai, and most of the time it was organized at Mumbai Marathi Patrakar Sangh, that hall of Mumbai Marathi Patrakar Sangh. In the year 2017, Varvara Rao was one of the speakers. The topic on which he spoke was 50 years of Naxalbari, looking back, looking forward. This same Varvara Rao, who is being called as civil rights activist by many intellectuals who also signed for his release, the same Varvara Rao gave interview to Rediff in the year 1997 as a Naxal leader and PWG, that is People's War Group, which is one of the Maoist fronts. So he gave interviews to Rediff as Naxal leader and Maoist ideologue. And the same Varvara Rao was invited as a speaker for this Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Lecture in the year 2017. Similarly, her writings were compiled and edited by two people, Anand Teltumde and Shoma Sen, who were professors. Anand Teltumde was a professor in Goa Institute of Management, and Shoma Sen was a professor. She was HOD of English Department of Nagpur University. So both of them, they compiled her writings and edited it and published it on behalf of Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Committee. Now the question is, why would somebody who believes in democracy think of publishing writings of a Maoist leader? That's all from my side.
Thank you, Smita ji, for a very interesting information on urban Naxals and Maoism as such. So my question is how these in case of Teesta Sidalwad and all that they get, or any other Maoist as such who are involved with the left, how do they get these bail and all these benefits at a very quick pace? I mean, the level of involvement at right from the Supreme Court is kind of mind-boggling. Like they have intercepted at such high levels. So how do you think it's being they are being inducted at a very early stage, or it's the money power, or how does it work? If you can shed some light on that, thank you.
Okay, firstly, as far as Teesta Settlewad is concerned, I really do not know whether she has active links with CPI Maoist. So whenever if I get an evidence on it, I will surely say it publicly. But today's situation is I really do not know whether she has any links. As far as the legal teams, as you rightly said, that even like after this Elgar Parishad accused and the arrest which followed and the kind of quick hearings they got by Supreme Court, or even the house arrest which was given to them till the time Supreme Court heard their petition. So if you remember in one of the slides I mentioned about legal warfare. So this legal teams and legal warfare is another important aspect. And how they get it, because they have team of lawyers which are at their service, and those teams make it possible. So I will stop there. I hope you understand.
Thank you.
Pureshwari, go ahead.
He's not muted, I think.
Pureshwari, you can unmute yourself. You can ask a question.
Okay. Selva Judam had scored a measure of success against the Naxalites some time back, about a decade and a half back. Why was that experiment not carried forward in other areas as well as in the area where it seemed to be working?
Okay. So Salwa Judum, which actually took place in 2005-2006 in Chhattisgarh. So even before Salwa Judum, there were 2-3 initiatives. I do not recollect their names as such, but there were initiatives which were kind of very local in as far as the scope or the spread is concerned. Salwa Judum was one such movement which was actually initiated by the tribal, and the tribal approached the government saying that we just have our conventional weapons in hand, and those Maoists, they are fighting with guns in their hand, and we need support from the government. So that is what was actually the beginning of Salwa Judum. Many times, many people project it as a government's initiative. Actually, it was not a government initiative. It was tribal initiative, because people were really fed up of this Maoism, and they actually stood against the Maoists. And when they realized that, okay, we are not able to confront this Maoists because of the weapons they have, and that is how they approached the government saying that we need your help. Now, as per the legal system, in emergency situations, the government can recruit something called as SPOs, that is special police officers. So that is what exactly the Chhattisgarh government did that time. They provided training of, I think, some 3 months to youngsters, and they kind of recruited them as special police officers, SPOs they are called as. And through these SPOs, the movement of Salwa Judum, it spread like, that time it spread like fire in those areas. And it is said that the Maoist documents mention that when this Salwa Judum phase was on, that time the Maoists were really scared because they really felt that whatever base they had that time, whatever support, local support they have achieved earlier, they are going to lose that support. That kind of situation arise that time. Now, why it was stopped? There's a lady called Nandini Sundar. She filed a case in Supreme Court. She mentioned 2-3 things, like she fought on 2-3 points. She said that there were some youngsters who were under 18 who were involved as SPOs, which was illegal. I'm just telling you very general points. I'm not getting into too many technicalities of that case. Another thing, she said that some of these people who were involved in Salwa Judum, they raped women. That is what she mentioned. Now, the government lost this case against her, and that is how there were certain directions given by Supreme Court in case of this Salwa Judum. So the recruitment of SPOs, it did not stop as such. Even today, the tribal are recruited as SPOs. There are certain conditions they have to follow, and they do follow that. So certain flaws which were there, they were highlighted against the government in this particular case. And because the government lost that case in Supreme Court, and that is how they say that Salwa Judum actually kind of stalled. But if we, like, how do we define Salwa Judum? If we say that recruitment of those SPOs was Salwa Judum, then the recruitment is still on. Beyond that, there have been like many of the people, many of the tribal, they were brought to the rehabilitation camps during Salwa Judum time. So some of them went back, some of them are still residing in those rehabilitation camps of Salwa Judum. So whether Salwa Judum is 100% stopped, not really, but whatever directions were given by Supreme Court, those directions were implemented by the government, the Chhattisgarh government. But like, why it was not implemented in rest of the areas which are influenced by Maoist? So the initiative has to come from the tribal. The problem is, if the tribal, they try to organize themselves, or like they can organize only if they get over that fear or insecurity. Because the Maoists, like whoever, if you see the way these Maoists function, what they do is, whoever tries to take stand or who has leadership qualities, or who think of doing something constructive in that area and take initiative, they kill that person. I'll give you 2 examples. Like in Maharashtra, there was one person called Patru Durge from Damarancha village. So he tried to get a lift irrigation project in his village. And for that, he came to Mumbai. From all the way from Damarancha, he came to Mumbai and he visited Mantralaya, and there he tried to kind of get that particular, he applied for that project. When Maoists came to know about it, when he went back, Patru Durge was killed by these Maoists. Similar situation happened in Sukhma in Chhattisgarh. There was a person called Shamnath Baghel. So this Baghel, what happened is, he tried to organize the villagers in Sukhma. There was the name of the village was Nema and Kunakulam. These 2 villages are nearby in Sukhma district. So this Shamnath Baghel, he tried to organize the villagers against the Maoists, and these villagers decided that they will not cooperate with the Maoists. What happened is, when he took that lead, and they also formed a group wherein the men in the families, they used to do patrolling for that area, and so that, Maoists do not enter that village. That particular person was also killed by Maoists. So whoever takes lead, Maoists generally kill those people. So what happens is, as it is, there is that threat, because Maoists, they have weapons in their hands, so people do have that fear of their life. Second thing is, whoever still try to take that initiative or try to lead, Maoists kill those leaders first. Because of that, people do not come forward or take lead. So it is a bit difficult to organize the tribals. So that is one of the reasons why this particular initiative could not spread to rest of the areas. That is what my opinion is, or that is how I analyze it. There may be some different perspective, like if you speak to different people on this particular subject, or people who are actually studying this subject, so you may get some more perspective. But if I look at it, that why it could not spread to rest of the area, so this is one of the reasons it could not spread.
Thank you, Smita ji. Pankaj ji, please.
Hello, hello. Can you hear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Smita ji, first of all, it was very much informative session. It's really, I thank you very much. So many things we didn't know. And the most important, I would say that, first of all, I'm really concerned about your life, because what you say that, in fact, please take care of, and I don't know what to say about that. And it is observed that we are in Canada, entire this democratic setup, these people, the leftist so-called, okay, internationally, I'm saying that all the universities, they are there. And they have been getting patronage by university. They are using the same apparatus of democracy, and they are working against democracy. And I think that is there, and most of people are coming from academia. So is there a way that the other side also, like there are so many people, they believe in a traditional democratic way to address any issues. If they can unite and they can also raise some voice so that these people can be subsided. And I don't know what's happening in India about that.
There is a strong lobby, I will call it a lobby only, which do exist. There have been certain reasons why this lobby could survive for so long. There are sometimes political reasons, there are sometimes institutional reasons, organizational reasons. But if this has to change, then the only action or the only actionable item is that, firstly, studying the modus operandi and understanding that modus operandi and coming up with a suitable modus operandi, how to deal with these things. So we have to come up with certain modus operandi, and certain things which cannot be can be talked publicly, certain things cannot be discussed publicly. I hope I answered your question.
Okay.
Or
yes.
not.
Yeah.
Pradnya ji, go ahead.
Hello. First of all, thank you. It was a very informative session. My question is something pertaining to fourth generation warfare that you mentioned. This idea was crystallized in the early 80s, if I understand it right. But now with the coming of social media, and is that also part of fourth generation warfare? And if so, what is the strategy to counter that? Because social media, it is able to reach much more people, and it's able to influence and have a wider net, so as to call it. And if there is a strategy, should it be something that involves people of the other ideology as well, so that it reaches more people? Because it can't be just one voice countering all these on social media.
Okay, so when you say other ideology, I
mean,
get that.
like, something like this group, or definitely much more than this group, who are not sympathetic to the Maoist ideology or the Naxalite ideology.
Okay, so the thing is, like, social media has actually changed the dimension of this particular war. I will call it war only. How it has changed the dimension, the reason why I'm making this statement is, there was a time, last 50 years, it was projected that Maoists were working for well-being of oppressed or underprivileged people. Now, how was it established, this particular narrative? It could be established just because there was a lobby working in media who helped in establishing this particular narrative. How social media has actually changed the dimension of this warfare is everybody, like for example, some Smita Gaikwad who is not writing for any newspaper or who is not a journalist, who does not have any say in the on the news channels, she can just open or start her own YouTube channel and she can actually express her thoughts, or she can just write on Twitter or Facebook and she can just present those facts. So these people started getting exposed because of social media. Social media has played a very important role in this. Another thing is it that are there groups who are working in this particular area? Yes, there are many groups working in this area. Like just to tell you, like when I got into this particular subject, it was in 2014, 2015. That was the time when I got into this subject full time. So since then till now, I came across at least hundreds of people who are actually working or at least writing about this subject or at least studying this subject or trying to understand the reality of this subject or trying to counter this particular whatever fake narrative. They are trying to counter it. So there are people on social media who are doing this. Now the point is whether it is sufficient. No, it is not sufficient. Why it is not sufficient? Because the number of people who are doing this fake propaganda, they are mainly using the established platforms. So the reach of those established platforms is much higher as compared to the social media reach. For example, if I write, it may reach 1,000 people. If I write for an established platform, it may reach lakhs of people. So the reach is something which makes a difference when it comes to social media versus the established platforms. So there is a need to enter these established platforms as well. At the same time, if we are not able to do that, then instead of one person writing it, at least 100 people need to multiply that voice, or 100 people need to write. So generally, like whenever I do sessions on this particular subject, so we do ask people that if somebody wants to work in this particular field, you pick your choice of subject, you pick whatever time you can give, you decide that how much, like whether it is 2 hours in a week or 5 hours in a week, whatever you can give for this particular subject, you start giving. And then we really want more and more people to get into this subject, study different dimensions of this subject. This subject is really huge. It is 50 years. If you see the stretch of this subject, it is almost 50 years. And imagine the number of states it has affected. So even if we select one particular state and if we start studying since beginning the journey of Maoism in that particular state, it will take at least 20 to 25 years to get into the reality and the details of this subject as for one particular state. So we need hundreds of people studying this subject, studying different dimensions of this subject, because there are dimensions, like for example, just somebody asked about the legal aspects. So there is legal dimension, there is propaganda dimension, there is social policy related dimension, there is tribal dimension, there is Dalit dimension. There are different dimensions of this subject which needs to be focused on. And one person of course cannot do that. There are different people who are doing this, but yes, we do need more people to do this, because we have to populate the digital space with facts and reality and evidences, and that is the need of the hour. If we want to kind of counter these whoever is setting this narrative, if we want to counter that narrative, then hundreds of people need to do this simultaneously, and of course it is required. And as I said in the beginning, groups like this can actually play an important role in doing so.
Thank you very much.
Hopefully we are contributing, Smitaji, in some small way.
Yes, you are. And in fact, I really have high hopes that, in the beginning, that first slide I mentioned about. So, I look forward to that day that those people who signed these documents, they are convinced that it was a mistake and whatever they were told was really something which was not facts.
Kushi, go ahead.
जी. Namaste, Smita ji.
Namaste.
Thank you so much for giving a very informative talk. I have a very quick question. So you mentioned there was a list in February 2014 of the United Front organizations. Is that list publicly available or?
Yes,
No?
it is. In fact, I can share it with the organizers. It is publicly available. If you search on Google as February 2014, the question number was 3838, which was asked in Lok Sabha. It was, I think, 18th February 2014. So if you search that, you may get. Otherwise, I will share it with the organizers as well.
Sriramji, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I just had a question. The central government has been saying the past couple of years that they have made significant progress in wiping out the Naxals in the jungle areas. Do you agree with that assessment? And if so, which states do you think they've made the most progress in, and which states they still have to do a lot more work in? Thank you.
Okay. So one thing is, generally, when government says, and it can be any government, whether it is Congress government or BJP government, any government declares that there is ebb in Naxalism, they generally focus on the number of encounters or number of deaths in that area, or number of, we call it incidents in that area. So like, for example, if number of encounters were higher in a particular year, in the next year, if the number of encounters are comparatively less, then they generally say that, okay, there is an ebb. My perception about it is completely different. And I'll tell you why it is different. I'm still thinking about what all can be the parameters to decide that there is a decline in Naxalism. As of now, the number of encounters or number of deaths is considered as a parameter. In my view, it is not sufficient. The reason being, Maoists, they do have a strategy that they attack when they want to attack. Otherwise, they prefer to lie low. So when we say that there is a dip in the number of encounters or number of incidents or number of deaths, I look at it as that there can be different reasons. So the ebb could be because of, one thing is because there is really a dip in Naxalism, or really there is no recruitment. That could be one of the reasons. Or probably the Maoists strategically have decided not to do encounters in that area, and instead of that, they have decided to reorganize. That possibility is always there. Now, how to differentiate the reasons? How do we say that what is the reason why that dip is there in encounters or deaths or whatever incidents? So depending upon the reason, we'll be able to decide that whether it is actually a decline in Naxalism. Till the time we do not know the reasons, we cannot just say that because the number of incidents have reduced, so there is a dip. Or that is why we can say that the Naxalism has actually, gone down, or the influence has gone down. So how do we know the reasons? Frankly speaking, I'm just a civilian now who do not have access to the internal or the secret information as such. So I won't be able to decide it. Whether the intelligence agencies, whether they have that access, I do not know. So when these kind of statements are made, I really get that question that this downfall or whatever, that decline in incidents, is it because the Maoists decided not to do encounters, or is it actually because the number of incidents have actually gone down because the Maoists have become weak in that area. So till the time that reason is not known, I won't be able to confidently say that there is actually a decline. So coming to your question, when the government claims that there is a dip in Maoism in so and so area, most of the time the parameter is because of the number of incidents. So to be honest, I'm not convinced about it. Why I'm not convinced about it? Because I won't be convinced till the time I really get to know the reason behind that decline. Just the numbers cannot be just the deciding factor that whether it is going down or going up.
Thank you, Smita ji. So we have one last question. Just the time. Shruti ji, go ahead.
Namaste ji. Thank you for that wonderful session. It was really mind-blowing, the facts that you gave. I'm a college student now. My question is, a lot of these student organizations are operating at college level, and most of the times what they propagate to these college organization, to these student organization, is very much related with these Naxalite groups and Maoist groups. So what do we do at a student level? This is starting at a very root level, the student's life, and this is very much, I see it every day in my college life. So what do we do about it?
You are from which college, if I know, if you can tell me? Hello? Am I audible?
No, you're audible. I think she just went on mute. Go ahead.
I'm from Tamil Nadu. I'm from a minority institution college, MCC.
Okay. So what you're saying is that there are groups operating in the college and they are propagating the Maoist thought process or ideology. That is what you're saying, right? Am I right in my perception?
Yes. Not just one college, but across the, a lot of these student organizations operate in colleges.
Okay, so one thing is if they are directly talking about the Maoist ideology as such, or they are directly propagating the Maoist ideology in the name of Maoist ideology, then because most of these kind of groups, they do not really say directly that they are working for Maoism or they are propagating Maoist ideology. They say it in different politically correct manner. They generally say it. If these kind of things are happening, then one thing is awareness is the key. The objective of these organizations is generally to recruit students into their organizations and later on influencing them further to join the Maoist ideology or the Maoist cadre or the Maoist party as such. So one thing to kind of which can act as a preventive measure is the awareness. Second thing is if you can approach the administration and if you can see whether the administration can play some role in this. If you think that the administration won't cooperate in this for whatever reasons, then in that situation, just awareness is something which can actually play a role or which can actually prevent these things from happening. And if you think that something is really grossly wrong and something really illegal happening, then legal action is another action which I can, because I do not know the specifics of what you're saying. So these are the options I'm telling you.